Welcome to Mayor Brown's Tech Talks podcast. Each podcast is designed to provide insights on legal issues relating to technology transactions and keep you up to date on the latest trends in data, digital, outsourcing, and software by drawing on the perspectives of practitioners who have executed technology transactions around the world. You can subscribe to this series on all major podcasting platforms. We hope you enjoy the program.
In this episode, we will focus on how to respond to requests for COVID-19 waivers from outsourcing service providers. My name is Julian Dibbell, and I'll be hosting the Tech Talks podcast. I am a senior associate in Mayor Brown's Chicago office, and I work in our technology transactions practice. Joining me today are my colleagues Linda Rhodes and Brad Peterson. Linda is a partner in Mayor Brown's technology transactions practice and is located in our Washington, D.C. office. Brad, also a partner, joins us from Mayor Brown's Chicago office. Brad is the leader of our global technology transactions practice. Before we get started, a brief note about timing. We are recording this podcast on April 1st, 2020, and in the past 2 weeks, we have seen the global effects and responses to the virus evolve at a truly unbelievable pace. We expect those rapid changes to continue in the near term. What we're giving you today is our perspective based on what we've seen in the market to date. The analysis of these issues may look much different in the weeks ahead as situations evolve. So with that brief introduction, let's get started with the episode. Hi, Brad. Hi, Linda.
Hi, Julian.
Hello, Julian.
So we have already been seeing in the first weeks of this crisis, outsourcing service providers are coming to our clients, their customers, asking that they sign a work-from-home acknowledgement or similar document. Tell us, what is a work-from-home acknowledgement?
So thanks, Julian. Yeah, it's an agreement whereby the provider literally asks the customer for permission to have its personnel work from home due to the numerous lockdowns, quarantines, and social distancing recommendations and orders from governmental authorities that are arising out of this COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the acknowledgments that we've seen are individualized for clients, but most appear to be standard forms that are generated by providers. Nevertheless, in either case, the forms provided by service providers, if they were granted as drafted by the providers, would have a fundamental effect on a typical managed services agreement.
Okay, and why would a provider need permission for its personnel to work from home?
The request to work from home is a request for a waiver of a very typical requirement in a managed service outsourcing arrangement. That requirement is that the provider perform the services from service locations that are actually listed in the contract, in the supplement or statement of work. And that requirement is not merely a preference. Instead, those listed service locations are subject to customer approval and identified as required locations in the agreement because of their logical and physical security controls, because of their systems performance, because of their backup systems, the management that's present at that facility, and other factors. And facilities with more stringent controls generally cost more than facilities without those stringent controls. So it's fair to assume that a customer who paid more to have the benefit of all those controls and technology and management and so forth had a reason to make the choices. For example, some facility requirements actually reflect regulatory requirements, and others provide risk mitigation or enhanced performance.
Okay, got it. So what are the concerns then that are raised by these work-from-home acknowledgments?
In the acknowledgments, providers are looking for more than merely acknowledgement that services will be provided by personnel from their homes rather than the approved locations for the duration of the lockdown periods. The acknowledgments frequently include numerous other broad waivers from non-performance, and in some cases even would have the customer hold the provider harmless from liability arising out of the provider's decision to have personnel work from home on personal devices.
Okay, so let's talk about those potential liabilities. Can you explain more specifically what the risks are for the customer?
Well, the risk for the customer is that the customer continues to have the same obligations under data privacy and security laws, and to the extent that the provider is accessing, storing, or processing the data of the clients and consumers or customers, they may have contractual obligations as to the privacy and security of data that they've received from their customers. So, if the service provider does not abide by the obligations that the outsourcing customer has under law and to its own customers, then the outsourcing customer will be in breach of those obligations, which it just simply cannot ignore. Those are not just legal and contractual obligations, but as we've all seen, violations of the data rights of third parties can result in significant market harm. In addition, the acknowledgements typically do not include any compensating controls or incentives for the provider to prioritize the customer or do what the provider can to comply with the customer's obligations. So, the customer who just signs the acknowledgement would have agreed to pay the same amount while being locked into a riskier contract for lower quality services in a less secure manner.
Okay. So then how have we been advising, or how should customers respond to requests for these waivers?
And so we believe the best practice is to agree to some provider personnel being permitted to work from home in light of the reality of the situation. But that has to occur in a manner where the personnel are still obligated to comply with the contractual obligations and subject to some modifications that both provider and customer agreed to. There also should be something in the acknowledgement that recognizes that this work from home permission has to end when these lockdowns, quarantines, and social distancing recommendations and orders cease. While it's important to address the real-world impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on performance obligations, broad waivers and excuse from non-performance put the customers unnecessarily at risk.
Okay. So on the one hand, yes, our recommendation is, in most cases, you need to permit some leeway for personnel to work from home. On the other hand, you don't want to agree to these broad waivers that the providers are showing up with. How exactly then does the customer proceed in this situation?
Customers should proceed first by responding quickly with a notice that the work from home acknowledgement is inconsistent with contractual obligations and not acceptable to the customer. However, because of the situation, the notice should also express openness to a governance conversation to work on a change order to mitigate the risk. Responding quickly with this sort of a notice gets the customer into the provider's queue for negotiation and reduces the risk that the provider will claim the non-response was a waiver. Also, responding in this way frames the work from home acknowledgement as what it is contractually, a change request.
I agree with everything that Brad said, but I'd also like to add that it's critical to review the actual contract clauses in your contract. While providers would like to provide a one-size-fits-all approach, which would be more efficient and quicker from their perspective, what we found is that the customer's position varies greatly depending upon what the actual managed services agreement says. For example, at one extreme, you may have a force majeure clause that recognizes that a pandemic or a government action is a force majeure event and that it fully excuses performance until the force majeure event ends. In a case like that, the customer may have little leverage or only leverage limited to the extent those mitigation clauses in the force majeure portion of the contract. For example, in some force majeure clauses, the provider is nonetheless required to use, quote, commercially reasonable efforts to perform. And so by discussing the acknowledgement with the provider, that opens the door to solidify what those commercially reasonable efforts might entail. At the other end, a force majeure clause in a contract may only talk about truly major forces like explosions or fires or floods. And if you have a contract like that, the provider may still be fully responsible for performing its obligations as contracted. So your leverage and your negotiating position might be a little bit different if that's what your contract says. Additionally, there may be business continuity or disaster recovery plans that the provider is required to implement that could address the challenges that the provider is facing. So what you really need to do is think about what's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. What situation would you be in if you didn't negotiate terms of an acknowledgement with your provider?
Why would it matter if personnel perform services at home rather than from the service provider facility?
Great question, Julian. The reason that customers want to have providers working from the office differs deal by deal. For example, if it's a call center operation and there's no confidential information or anything of that sort, it may just be that the sound quality is great from the call center, or it's got a tremendously fast internet connection, which provides all sorts of benefits. And those benefits might be easily sacrificed now in the COVID-19 era. But there's some customers who have the obligation to work from a service provider facility specifically because of compliance requirements that can't be waived. And some of them, because of the nature of the GDPR or the CCPA or customer contracts, it may be better to turn off the service entirely than to have it done in an insecure way. And the distinctions that governments are now drawing between essential and non-essential business activity are very good guide in some way. If the service, performing the services from home might imperil food, medical, or financial services operations, the customer may have not only an obligation that is entirely fair and reasonable for the customer to have priority on what are likely to be a limited number of seats in the facility, but also that the service provider may have more legal latitude to perform the essential services at the facilities because the governmental regulations allow facilities to be used for performing essential functions. So as you said, it's a critical question. Why does it matter that the personnel perform services at the facility instead of at home?
Okay, great. We talked earlier about how the service providers may be dealing with multiple customers, and they're trying to come up with hopefully a one-size-fits-all acknowledgement form. Looking at it from the other perspective, the customer may also be dealing with a situation where they are receiving requests for these waivers from multiple providers with different concerns or different approaches. How should a customer handle that situation?
Great question again, Julian. So notwithstanding what I said about your response to the provider standard form, from the customer's perspective, you do want to develop some counter proposals that would work for multiple providers. That's not to say one size fits all, solutions in the case of your providers, but I think you can come up with some key points or key provisions that you need to include in all these acknowledgements that you have across the board with your provider. So you might call that some sizes that fit together in most situations. For example, some customers are able to quickly provision VPN access to providers to the relevant customer systems, thus being able to implement adequate logical data security to make up the loss of physical security. But you want to do this subject to minimum security requirements, such as personnel who have signed work from home waiver, non-disclosure agreements to be sure they're fully complying with everything that continue to be their obligation, and to work on fully patched versions of Windows 10 with the customer's VPN loaded. Other customers may be able to reallocate tasks, such that there's a reduced number of essential personnel at the provider facility who can do the most critical tasks, and then allow those provider personnel that are working from home to perform less critical tasks. So you may have some policies across the board that you could implement across your multiple providers.
Okay, a lot of issues then to work through. From a process perspective, what's the guidance on how the parties should work through these questions?
In this time of stress, the best way to do it is to leverage your existing change order or other governance processes. You need to use the same process to figure out what controls will be difficult to maintain, what possible workarounds exist to mitigate the risk, and so forth, as you would for any other change order requested for any other purpose. And by relying on the established process, you reduce risk, particularly if the governance team itself is working from home while facing the complexity of numerous work-from-home acknowledgement requests. Then the goal is, as always with a change order process, to sign an amendment or change order in an acceptable format.
Okay, more specifically, what does that mean, sign an amendment or change order in an acceptable format? Linda?
The first time I got one of these work-from-home requests from a provider, it struck me that they not only asked for acknowledgement to have their personnel work from home, but they further went on to ask for waivers from other contractual obligations. For example, providers are seeking waivers from physical and information security requirements, which we've touched on previously in the program. They're also looking for some audit right obligations and performance standards. In some cases, providers will caveat it by saying, well, okay, we're just asking for this waiver or excuse from non-performance in a case where those obligations, quote, cannot be enforced on remote devices or remote locations. But to me, that's almost as ambiguous as just excusing them altogether. So whether these requests from your provider are specific or general, the waivers put customers at risk of being out of compliance with their own legal and contractual obligations. And it potentially creates data continuity and other business risks. And I'm sure, we have many other examples of this.
Yeah, right. So you mentioned information security obligations at the top of the list. How should a customer respond when the provider asks for a request to modify or be released from those very important information security obligations?
We recommend seeking alternate methods for achieving the security that the provider location offered. For example, managed service agreements often require that services be performed in segregated locations where service provider personnel cannot print, download to USB drives, have smartphones, or otherwise have the ability to copy sensitive data. To the extent possible, those should be replicated in the work-from-home environment. For example, software loaded on a work-from-home device might disable its USB drives, disable any screenshot software, and disable any print functions. Similarly, managed services often rely on the physical access control at the facility, generally with some sort of a device or a token, a pass card to get into the building, or you may have to go past a guard. A reasonable alternative approach, replacing a physical security process with a logical security process, might be multi-factor authentication. You could force each of the people who log onto the network to have some sort of a separate digital token, perhaps a code that shows up on their cell phones. Similarly, if the management approach is a look-over-the-shoulder management approach, that could be replaced by having the management team watching a screen copy.
Okay, so these are complex, intricate concerns, particularly around issues of security. Should the customer be immediately thinking about consulting their cybersecurity or data privacy counsel around these questions?
Yes, absolutely. In addition to consulting your technical specialist in cybersecurity and data privacy, you should consulting cybersecurity and data privacy counsel is essential in determining whether the alternate approach is adequate to meet the current legal needs.
Linda, what audit waivers are we seeing providers requesting?
I've actually seen providers look for clients to waive all of their audit rights entirely for the duration of the lockdown orders. However, a complete waiver of rights is really unnecessary, and it leaves the client without recourse where audit rights are necessary or appropriate, for example, where a breach might be suspected. And while it may not be possible to conduct an on-site audit of a lockdown facility, and you may be able to address that in one of these acknowledgement letters, many of the audit rights may be available to the client that don't require access to a facility, such as access to records and personnel engaged in the performance of the service.
All right. And why is it so important for customers to retain audit rights through this period?
Well, it is important for clients to maintain these audit rights, in particular, given that the need to ensure adherence to contractual terms may actually be heightened as personnel work remotely. Thus, audit rights should be limited only as necessary, perhaps to restrict on-site audit rights during this crisis. Similarly, consider expanding the audit rights as needed to monitor and manage the new work methods that are being implemented to provide for work-from-home environments.
And Brad, you mentioned compliance with security and privacy and other legal obligations of concern, but also that there may be a drop in performance quality as a result of these new arrangements. Are we actually seeing providers specifically requesting waivers from their performance and performance level obligations under the contracts?
Yes, we are routinely seeing these work-from-home acknowledgement requests or COVID-19 waivers seeking relief from service levels and other performance standards. And when asked, the suppliers give reasons such as limited bandwidth at home, distracted workers, or inability to use the tools that are available only at the supplier facility.
Yeah, and I would like to just add to that, a broad excuse from service levels and other performance standards are almost never reasonable. For example, there's no reason for excusing providers from meeting accuracy service levels or meeting obligations to exercise due professional care with qualified and skilled personnel. They should continue to meet those obligations, notwithstanding this COVID-19 situation.
That said, though, this is an unprecedented emergency, and if there is a particular service level that a provider reasonably states or believes that it cannot meet because of the remote work environment, the provider's concern should be addressed through the governance process or a conversation. And in that conversation, the provider would describe with specificity which obligations it cannot meet, why it can't meet them, and what workarounds or modifications would resolve the concerns. The customer can then make an informed decision about if and to what extent adjustments, if any, might be made without foregoing rights to receive the contracted 4 levels of performance.
Are there liability issues that customers should be aware of?
Yes, the largest problem with work-from-home acknowledgments is that they actually ask the customer to waive its contractual rights and for the provider to be excused from its obligations. One way to quickly bridge the gap on these work-from-home acknowledgments is to reduce them to what they actually claim to be, which is acknowledgments that the provider is delivering services from the homes of the provider's personnel. The parties can then agree later that liability for a reduction in service or non-performance or other non-compliance will be excused or modified, and that doesn't necessarily have to be up front. There's no urgency about resolving that now, and there's not necessarily a benefit to the customer in doing that. This allows for the provider to avoid liability for failing to inform the customer that it's going to be working from home, but then it leaves other issues open to be determined based upon how the provider implements the work-from-home processes.
Okay. Well, we've been hearing a lot about the providers asking for a lot of concessions from the customers having to think about what they're willing to concede. Are there concessions that the customer should be asking of the provider in these acknowledgments, also related to the crisis situation?
That's in some ways a relationship question, and how the customer and the provider have successfully worked together in the past to handle the ongoing changes in the managed service environment. And they might say, well, we'll be gracious on this one, and we expect the provider to be gracious on the next one, or the provider has been gracious on the last one, so we'll be gracious on this one. However, if the relationship is such that the smart thing to do is have a fair trade on each change request, customers should consider reducing their own obligations. For example, if the customer paid a 5% premium to be at a certain level of supplier facility instead of using a work-from-home environment, that customer might reasonably expect a 5% price reduction for allowing work from home. Similarly, a customer that committed a particular volume of transactions to a provider might reasonably expect that the commitment would be reduced or maybe even waived if the provider is unable to continue with the prior level of security or performance.
Yet they, too, are suffering the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe may have their own issues with trying to meet their contractual obligations. So that if you are a customer in an industry that's been hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, you may be looking for relief from your provider from volume or pricing commitments, just as an example. Similarly, customers may themselves be working from home and then able, for example, to allow provider personnel to sit with the customer personnel as part of knowledge transfer. So customer concerns should be addressed in the context of negotiating these acknowledgments with providers. Again, using an appropriate change order format or whatever works with your particular contract.
Great. All right. So what have we learned today? What are the core takeaways from today's episode?
I'd say that the core takeaway is that a work-from-home acknowledgement, although it's not styled just as a standard contract change, is in fact, in most ways, a standard contract change. And yes, it has urgency, and yes, it's the result of a particularly important event. But the key to success is to follow your process, focus on what matters and why in each particular deal. Consider the implications against each element of your deal, price, performance, security, and so forth. And then finally, choose your targets. You've got, at this point, probably you may have all of your high priority digital suppliers coming to you with some sort of a work from home acknowledgement. If you do, consider which of those is most important and where to put your energy. And then work with your highest priority suppliers to develop a successful mutual resolution to this crisis. And we believe that through that, we can continue the strength of the existing relationship and perhaps come out of the back end of this crisis with a stronger and more flexible relationship. And perhaps one where you're better able to leverage work from home and other technologies to deliver services more creatively, more flexibly, with more innovation in the years to come.
Well, that's a promising note to end on. Thank you, Brad and Linda, for your thoughtful analysis and valuable perspective. For those listening, if you have any questions regarding this podcast, please send them along to techtransactions, T-E-C-H, transactions, at mayorbrown.com. Your question will be forwarded to the appropriate presenter for a response. Thank you again. This concludes our podcast. I hope you found this program useful, and thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this program. You can subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. To learn about other Mayor Brown audio programming, visit mayorbrown.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening.